Hey, what's going on, America's History people? We have chapter 23 for you of the 8th edition. As always, if you're using another one, it will match up as well. Make sure you check out the description. I have lots of links to videos that go more in detail than this chapter, and lots of things from this chapter are part of the new curriculum. All right, let's talk about early responses to the Great Depression from 1929 to 1932. That is Herbert Hoover as president. So Hoover believed very much in volunteerism and hard work to get out of the Depression. He thought if people just worked hard and people volunteered and provided community service, that would solve the Great Depression. He did not take the United States off the gold standard like many European countries did. And during his administration, we had the Smoot-Hawley tariff, or the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And if you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you are familiar with this. This is what the teacher Ben Stein is saying in that scene. This significantly raised tariff rates. Remember, Hoover is a Republican. Republicans want to raise tariffs. This, however, led to retaliatory rates from other countries. They began jacking up tariff rates on the United States. He did establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, which provided federal loans to businesses. However, it spent too little money too cautiously, so it was not enough to really alleviate the problems of the Great Depression. Hoovervilles and Hoover blankets began to develop, and Hoovervilles were shanty towns mockingly named after Herbert Hoover, and Hoover blankets were newspapers that people would cover themselves with. Now, the bonus army was a PR disaster for the Hoover administration. These were 15,000 World War I veterans that demanded an early bonus payment that wasn't due to them until the 1940s, but because they were so hard hit from the Great Depression, they went to Washington, D.C., camped on the Capitol lawn, and asked for the money to be paid early. Well, Herbert Hoover ordered the army to disperse the bonus army, and his popularity plummeted. It decreased significantly. Here you see current military personnel beating up Army veterans to get them out of Washington, D.C. They would actually burn down their campgrounds. In the 1932 election, we have Hoover versus FDR. And FDR, you could see according to this map, absolutely just whoops Herbert Hoover, 472 to 59 in the Electoral College. And unemployment and bank failures continued throughout the late 1932 and early 1933 years. And this was a major problem facing FDR when he becomes president. All right, FDR promises the American people something called a New Deal. And in his first 100 days, he passes an incredibly high amount of legislation. Now, the fireside chats were presidential addresses via the newly popular radio in which FDR would talk to the American public and encourage them to put their money back in banks. He said that the banks were safe. The Brains Trust was a group of unofficial advisors that helped draft legislation. These were professors from Harvard and other universities. Frances Perkins, we learned about her before. She was the first female cabinet member. And the 100 Days legislation was legislation that focused on four major areas. We have banks, agriculture, business, and unemployment. These four areas were hit harder than almost any other. So let's start off talking about banking reform. But before we do, let's look at key concept 7.1, Roman numeral 3, letter A. The liberalism of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal drew on earlier progressive ideas and represented a multifaceted approach to both the causes and effects of the Great Depression, using government power to provide relief to the poor, stimulate recovery, and reform the American economy. So one of the first things FDR does, and here he is signing into legislation, the bank holiday and closing of banks. And what this did was for several days, if not weeks, banks would be closed and they could not reopen until they proved to be sound. And this is the Emergency Banking Act legislation that FDR is signing here. So many banks were failing because people would run to the banks to withdraw all their money, and the banks didn't have enough deposits in there to pay out the cash, and they would go bankrupt. Now, the Glass-Steagall Act created the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and this would insure bank deposits at that time up to $2,500. And today it's $250,000. You can go to the bank and you'll see the FDIC symbol. For agriculture and manufacturing, the Agricultural Adjustment Act sought to rectify overproduction of farm goods. Remember, farmers kept producing more and more goods. What does that do to the price when you produce more and more goods? Yeah, you got it. It plummets. And this paid farmers not to grow crops. However, this benefited large landowners, not sharecroppers, because the money was given to whoever held the title of the land, and sharecroppers did not hold the title to the land. The National Recovery Administration was set up by the NIRA, And this is where industries agreed on prices and production quotas. However, both the AAA and the NRA were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, which we'll see in just a few minutes. So let's talk about unemployment relief. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided federal money to give to states for relief programs. So this allowed states to have different ideas. The Public Works Administration focused on construction projects, and that's really going to be a theme of these New Deal programs. Lots of construction and lots of different types of building of infrastructure. The Civil Works Administration, or the CWA, was established during the really harsh winter of 1993 to 1994 and provided over 4 million jobs. Again, they focused on construction projects like bridges, roads, etc. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, provided outdoor work, conservation, and planting of trees. And these were mostly young men, 18 to 24, and they would send part of their paycheck back home to help support their families. And unfortunately, the CCC was segregated. Blacks and whites were segregated into different camps under the CCC. For the housing crisis, 500,000 families lost their homes in a very short time, and the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, was established, and this helped regulate interest rates for mortgages. And I actually have an FHA loan. When I bought my house in 2006, my wife and I applied for and received an FHA loan, so that is still around today. Let's jump on over to the Security and Exchange Commission. One of the problems that Roosevelt thought was that the stock market was not regulated enough, so the SEC began to regulate the stock market and sought to prevent abuses. Now, FDR does have his critics both on the right and the left. A key concept 7.1, Roman numeral 3, letter B, says radical union and populist movements pushed Roosevelt toward more extensive reforms, even as conservatives in Congress and the Supreme Court sought to limit the New Deal's scope. So the Liberty League was established, and this criticized the government spending under the New Deal. And the National Association of Manufacturers used radio and other media to promote their anti-Roosevelt message. And Schechter versus Poultry and Butler versus the United States were two Supreme Court cases that declared the NRA and the AAA, respectively, unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So that's critics on the right and the Supreme Court. Now on the left, you have people like Francis Townsend, who advocated giving $200 a month to seniors over 60, and this was influential in Social Security. And you have Huey Long, a senator and governor from Louisiana, who came up with the Share Our Wealth program, or giving citizens $5,000 by taxing the rich. The first New Deal really focused on economic recovery, whereas the second New Deal focused on social justice and providing a safety net. Now let's talk about the Wagner Act. Going back to the NRA being declared unconstitutional, Section 7B of the NRA allowed unions to negotiate, to collectively bargain. So since that was declared unconstitutional, unions lost many rights. So under the Wagner Act, and here is FDR signing the Wagner Act, workers had the right to join unions, and they could not be fired for joining a union. So this was a huge boost to unions. The Social Security Act, again inspired by Dr. Francis Townsend, provided pensions for retired workers and also compensation for unemployed and disabled workers. Now, the New Deal liberalism, this is this new term that began. Liberalism traditionally had been associated with free markets, and we begin to see a shift of liberalism being associated with the Democratic left. All right, let's jump on over to the 1936 election. We have the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, which was one of the largest New Deal programs. They employed over 8 million workers during its time, and again focusing on construction, roads, bridges, building of infrastructure. Now in the 1936 election, Alfred Landon challenged FDR, and he lost the election pretty badly. He won only Vermont and Maine. So I mentioned earlier that the Supreme Court declared some New Deal programs unconstitutional, so FDR sought to change the court, and he proposed appointing a new judge for every judge over 70. And if you look at these guys, there's quite a few over 70, actually 6 of them. So that would allow FDR to appoint up to 6 and increase the number of justices to 15. This court packing plan, as it's often called, was overwhelmingly rejected by virtually everybody, including members of FDR's own political party. They felt this was a violation of separation of powers. However, the Supreme Court began to come around to New Deal programs. Now, Roosevelt was was given blame for a recession because FDR cut back on spending due to an improved economy. And when this government cut back in spending, the U.S. went into a pretty bad recession. And from that moment forward, FDR really embraced this idea of Keynesian economics. And this is the idea that government must spend money in a depression to quote-unquote prime the pump and stimulate the economy. So the idea is if people aren't spending money, if the government does, it will improve the economy. It's also known as deficit spending, or spending more than you bring in. So let's talk about organized labor again. Union membership increased to 23%, thanks in part to the Wagner Act. And the Congress of Industrial Organization, or the CIO, was a labor union that organized all workers within an industry regardless of skill level. When we're talking about women in the New Deal, gender inequities persisted. Eleanor Roosevelt was a key player in the administration of FDR. She was known as the eyes and ears of FDR, and she helped transform the image of the First Lady. And unfortunately for women, they were often paid less than men for doing the same type of jobs. And the CCC, one of the larger programs, did not allow women to join. Jumping on over to African Americans under the New Deal, the Resettlement Administration helped small farmers buy land, mostly sharecroppers from the South. And African Americans during this time began to overwhelmingly vote Democratic. That is such an important concept to know. Please make sure you know this at all costs. African Americans voted overwhelmingly Democratic and still do to this day. The CCC, as I mentioned earlier, had separate segregated camps for African Americans, and unfortunately, lynching persisted throughout the 1900s at alarmingly high rates. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 African Americans that were charged with raping 2 white women on a train. 8 of them were sentenced to death. They eventually received new trials. Eventually, the death sentences were overturned. The AAA did not help sharecroppers, as I mentioned earlier. The checks were given to landowners who rarely, if ever, passed the payment along to sharecroppers. For Native Americans, John Collier was the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, and he was instrumental in the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act, often known as the Indian New Deal. And this reversed the assimilation policy of the Dawes Act that had been around for about 50 years. And many Native Americans were given religious freedom and status as semi-sovereign nations. Let's jump on over to the West. Mexican Americans benefited from programs like the WPA and the CCC, and most Chinese were excluded from the New Deal program. So remember, there's a lot of resentment towards Chinese going back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. FDR sought to have land benefit the needs of humans more so than preserving the environment. And we have the Dust Bowl, which was a horrific environmental disaster of the 1930s. It affected mostly the Great Plains region, where there was a lack of natural resources, and it was caused in part by overcultivation of farmland. If you look at this blizzard, these were often known as black blizzards. Just huge amounts of dust and dirt would just come sweeping over the Great Plains. And Okies were people that fled to California, and their plight was the main focus of Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. And Dorothy Lange was a very famous photographer, and here's one of her most famous pictures of the Great Depression, and this is titled Migrant Mother. Here's a 26-year-old woman, I believe, with 4 children, and faced lots of hardships during the Great Depression. All right, Tennessee Valley Authority still around. This focused on flood control, electricity development, etc. And you could see just how much of an area the Tennessee Valley Authority really impacted, not just Tennessee, many other states as well. This provided a significant amount of electricity to farms, homes, and factories, and the Rural Electrification Administration helped provide electricity to rural areas and went from 10% to over 90% in just a few short years. The Grand Coulee Dam was built on the Columbia River in Washington state, and it was the largest electricity producer in the world up to that time. And during the New Deal, over 20,000 artists, musicians, and writers were employed by the federal government to help bring art to the masses. All right, key concept 7.1, Roman numeral 3, letter C. Although the New Deal did not completely overcome the Depression, it left a legacy of reforms and agencies that endeavored to make society and individuals more secure, and it helped foster a long-term political realignment in which many ethnic groups, African Americans, and working class communities identify with the Democratic Party. I mentioned that earlier about African Americans. So what are some legacies of the New Deal? Well, millions paid taxes into Social Security, and that program is still around today. 1/3 of the population received government assistance, and the New Deal was criticized by both the right and the left for either not going far enough or going too far. And there's a change in voting patterns. Holy cow, was this started? It's so important to know. Unions, blacks, and many immigrants predominantly voted Democratic, and that is still true in large part to today. All right, let's do a quick recap. The bonus army, know it. Hoover versus FDR's response to the Great Depression, be familiar with it. New Deal programs, I would pick about 4 or 5 that you're familiar with. Critics of the Great Depression, know some on the right, on the left, and the Supreme Court as well. The New Deal's impacts on women, African Americans, and Native Americans, absolutely know that. The TVA, and finally, voting patterns, how they shifted during the Great Depression. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate your support. I look forward to seeing you right back here for chapter number 24. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the section below, and we'll figure out in chapter 24 what is going on with this picture. Thank you again for watching. I appreciate it, and best of luck on all of your tests this year, especially the one in May. Have a good day.